Hi everybody, I'm back. As always, short little hiatus there. Got stuff going on. Trying to get on top of life things at the moment. But a lot of requests if I could get some content uploaded for the YouTube today. Made an Instagram post. It's been a week where I basically hear the usual run of the mill stuff about what's important for muscle growth, and it's the same kind of stuff as usual. You know, time under tension, mind to muscle connection, metabolic stress, the pump, and all that kind of bullshit that I have to kind of hear on a consistent basis that really has nothing to do with your long-term gains or short-term gains either. But the one that I was thinking about today that still every once in a while gains some traction and people don't seem to understand kind of how it has an application in hypertrophy training is deloads. So there was a study that was done a bit back that did a deload in the middle of a mesocycle where they trained for so many weeks, did the deload in the middle, finished up. The people that were in the deload group had less hypertrophy over the course of the study than the people who did the continuous training, which makes all the sense in the world because there's a lot of myths surrounding deloads, and I'm going to try to cover those, including where deloads came from in the first place. So deloads actually are something that started over in the endurance training community, runners, cyclists, all that kind of stuff, and they did what's called tapering. So there's a lot of contention now actually in the performance world with that stuff, where now people realize you should not need to do a taper because you shouldn't be overrunning your recovery ability in your training leading up to competition in the first place. Now, the meatheads out there who are still running around saying tapering or deloads have legitimate application do not seem to understand some of the physiology that's going on here. And that is, number one, is that their kind of overarching theme is that when you do the taper and you have the performance increase, or you do a deload and have the performance increase, that you needed all that excessive work in order to get the adaptations. But again, that comes back to now there's lots of coaches and their performance-oriented community, endurance performance community, that have brought this to light, that they actually don't see any increase in performance when they simply use more moderate volume loads compared to high volume loads, and they just don't have to do the taper. So if they're getting all the adaptations they need in terms of an improvement in performance and those kind of things, and then they're just not getting the fatigue that comes with the excessive workload, there's no reason to do both the taper or the excessive workload. If that doesn't make sense to anyone, I don't know what to say. The excessive workload just creates more fatigue. So the reason why that you see a performance increase on the other side of the taper is because fatigue is allowed to subside, and fatigue is a temporary and reversible decrease in training performance. So if you take a deload or you do a taper, then you allow fatigue to subside, and then the increase in performance is allowed to be expressed in training. It is not because there's something magical other than that. And again, the idea that you have to do this excessive amount to get the adaptations isn't shown anywhere in the literature, in the data. In all of the data across the board, it consistently shows that we basically get adaptations, an increase in adaptations up to a point, and then there's a nonlinear relationship, which means once we've done enough work to create the maximum amount of adaptations or pretty close to it, any work that goes over that is just going to create more fatigue that we have to recover from. That's indisputable. And then the more advanced we become, especially when we're talking about hypertrophy training, a little less volume or work that we can recover from, because we're able to recruit the highest of the threshold motor units, and those fibers that are controlled by those are the most easily damaged. So the idea that you need to do excess volume or train a whole bunch or whatever to get all the last bit of gains as you're an advanced person is literally backwards. But let's stay on point here with talking about deload. So the idea from deloads was brought over from tapering with endurance people, which why they did that, I don't know. So if you understand the physiology behind what makes muscle grow, what keeps muscle, how muscle responds to training stress, you would understand very clearly that volume has a nonlinear relationship. You only need enough volume to kick out kick off myofibral protein synthesis. You need to allow that to run its course. And then when it comes back to baseline, you go back in the gym and you train that muscle again. That's it. All right. It's not any more difficult than that. So there's a couple of things that people believe that happen in just kind of pushing a deload in. So rather than looking at the physiology, what people did was they took all of these training ideas or principles and then they tried to make them fit. Rather than saying this is how the physiology works, we're going to make all these outside variables fit, even though it doesn't align with the physiology. And deloads is one of those things. So if your idea is I'm going to do a whole bunch of volume, take a deload, and I'm going to allow those like magical growth to happen while I'm doing nothing, that only happens with steroids, that's wrong. And then the other idea is that you get resensitized to the training stimulus, which is absolute bonkers horseshit. Okay, that's bananas, stupid horseshit. In every study where we look at what goes on at the fiber level, when you first start training, you have the repeated bout effect. Most of the protective mechanisms that come from the repeated bout effect happen in the very first training session, and there's the continued repeated bout effect, but it's very small in magnitude. So the people that also have gone around and saying that there's not muscle damage or edema or swelling or whatever after these high volume studies, and then they use the repeated bout effect, they've literally said to me, well, tell me like you don't know how the repeated bout effect works. I'm like, actually, I do know how the repeated bout effect, it's you that doesn't understand how it works, because pretty much 85%-ish, I'm pulling that out, but for the most part, the majority of protective mechanisms and fiber type shifts that you're gonna see in the repeated bout effect is gonna happen from the first training session. And then you'll get a little bit extra that happens from there on out, but maybe only for a couple of workouts where there's a little bit more shifting of glycolytic fibers into hybrid fibers that are more combination of glycolytic and oxidative. So the more oxidative fiber types that you have, the more protective that they are against muscle damage. However, they're not capable of producing as much force and they have a smaller degree of cross-sectional area. So your type 2 fibers, which are more glycolytic, don't have as much protective mitochondria mechanisms against muscle damage, and they also take the longest to recover, but they can grow really large. So there's that trade-off, right? So the idea that you resensitize to the hypertrophy stimulus, which is mechanical tension, is absolute nonsense. It's nonsense. So when you go in, let's say you do your first workout of like all these new exercises. So let's say you stimulate some fibers that you had not been using. So some of those, you have some fiber type shifts from that first workout. So they say, hey, let me get a little bit more protective against this damage, and then we'll be able to go back to work after that, and I'm gonna be able to grow. So when you have damage that's being incurred, what actually is happening is you're stealing cellular resources from myofibral protein synthesis that have to be allocated towards repair and regeneration of the myofibrils. They can't use the same amount of myofibral protein synthesis for myofibril addition, and that's muscle growth. So the idea that you go in and you get sore and you get a new training stimulus and that's going to cause more muscle growth is nonsense. It creates more muscle damage, and you should go, if you go look at the DeMoss research where they looked at muscle damage, myofibral protein synthesis, and then myofibril addition, you'll see that when muscle damage is high, it uses most of myofibral protein synthesis for repair and regeneration. And then as the protective mechanisms come down over the weeks, you will be able to see more myofibril addition because of the fact that the protective mechanisms are in place. That's the physiology, guys. You don't get resensitized to the hypertrophy stimulus because you took a deload. All you did was the fiber type shifts will go back to more glycolytic based, and then when you start training again after that week off or whatever you do with your deload, you just incur more muscle damage. Or if you start doing new movements, you just incur more muscle damage. That's what happens 100% of the time. And then you get the fiber type shifts, protective mechanisms, and you keep training, and that's when you can start growing. So there's no resensitization, like getting resensitized to the stimulus. The stimulus is always there. You just either have more protective mechanisms in place or less protective mechanisms in place. And then after you train, you get them back in place, and then you have to work to get myofibral protein synthesis to allocate more myofibrils. So that was one of them. that there's a resensitization. You get resensitized. You take that time off so you can get resensitized. That's why some people have tried to use soreness as an allocation of that. Soreness, which is not the same as muscle damage, is related to delayed onset muscle soreness, which is related to, from all we can tell at this point, what the theory that's holding up quite well and has been for a little bit now, is the muscle spindle nerve damage, which has nothing to do with with muscle damage itself, but I think there's probably some connection or relationship there in some kind of way. Or there may be some mechanisms that are overlapping, kind of like how myofibril protein synthesis, it can either cause, either does repair, regeneration, or creates muscle growth. I think there's probably some overlapping mechanisms between muscle damage and soreness, but then there's also probably not, and you're probably just confused right now. But the reason why I say that is because you can go and do a workout for weeks or months on end and stop getting sore, but muscle damage can still be present. And we see that in the data when we see the amount of swelling and inflammation and stuff that's still going on for weeks and weeks and weeks into some of these studies. So the idea that you're getting sore and that's a sign that there's things that have been stimulated, that's just not true either. Cannot use muscle soreness as an indication that muscle growth was stimulated, because you can get sore just by doing new movements, stuff you haven't done, etc., so forth and so on, and there may be zero mechanical tension involved. Go out and do a long run if you haven't been running, and you'll get sore. And anybody who tells you that there's studies that show you get similar degrees of hypertrophy from running as you do in the initial few weeks of lifting is fucking nonsense. It's absolute bullshit, pardon my language. That one drives me crazy. There's no such thing. There's a downhill running study, which is an eccentric based cardio study that showed some muscle growth would increase, but it's not even closely related to what we see from strength training. Anyway, so the deload thing. So the idea that you get resensitized to the stimulus, that's not a real thing. The other one is for people who say, well, clearly deloads work because if I take a deload, I come out on the other side, I'm stronger. And I'm like, yes, of course you are, because the fatigue subsided, so strength expression goes up. I just explained that. But people will still say that. Here's the times that you can use a deload. If you just are burnt on training and you just want some time off, take some time off, because mental exhaustion from training, I think, can be a real thing. The other thing, now here's the way to use a deload. If you're going to use a deload, let's say you're doing 6 sets for chest twice a week. Why do I even do that? I don't know. But let's say you're doing 6 sets for chest twice a week, and you've been plateaued for a while, and you could have a fatigue plateau. So let's say you're going to go in and you say, I'm going to cut that down. I'm literally going to cut it in half. I'm going to do 3 sets on one day and 3 sets on the other day. Instead of 12, I'll just do 6 for the week and see what happens. If you do that and you see progressive overload start occurring again, then you don't start adding back volume in later. That's feedback telling you that you were not recovering from the amount of volume that you were doing. So that's what that is. No different than we talk about with the endurance guys and the runners and stuff. Like, once they've realized, oh, we don't even need to do that much work to get the same amount of performance output, they're like, why aren't we doing all this extra work and leading to overuse injuries and then doing a taper just to get to a same place that we would get to if we did far less work. So if you cut your volume down, but train to the same proximity to failure, and you see a performance increase, that is feedback that you were overrunning your ability to recover. You're creating too much muscle damage, which causes an inflammatory effect, which reduces central nervous system output, which means you can't recruit as many motor units. There you go. That's your map, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there is one way you can use a quote unquote deload, but it's not planned. You just say, hey, am I in a plateau? And what's the plateau? Chris and I did a podcast on this. What's the plateau flow chart? So if you're in a fatigue plateau, that's what a fatigue plateau would be. If you reduce your volume, say cut your volume in half, and you see progressive overload increase, that tells you that you don't increase your volume back after that. You keep it right there where you're making gains again. So that's one way that you can use a deload, is that reduction in volume, proximity to failure stays the same. The other way is, like I said, if you just need to take some time off. But you should not have a good hypertrophy mesocycle, should not need a planned deload. In my groups, I use what's called an acclimation week when we go into a new mesocycle. And the acclimation week, basically is just to get people used to doing the new motions. We go pretty light, we don't go hard, we don't get close to failure. It lets people know kind of where their loading is going to need to be when we do start going hard in the paint for the next week. And it gets people used to doing a motion. Maybe they haven't done that motion before, and then they need like a form check, or they need a couple of workouts to look at that. So it's not a deload. It's literally what I just called. It's an acclimation. Acclimate to the load, acclimate to the motion. I think that covers the deload stuff. Again, if you have to do a planned deload, you probably do not know how to program properly. The hypertrophy training never needs planned deloads. If you need to bring volume down and that's a deload, then you use that as a way to give yourself feedback that you were doing too much and stick with the amount of volume that's giving you progressive overload again. Hope that gives you guys some good knowledge, and I hope you have a great Saturday. God bless you.